Good evening, everyone. I am privileged to introduce to you four very accomplished youth from whom we will learn a lot. Ashwini Selvakumeran, she, her, is a fourth-year student at St. Michael's College. She's majoring in Peace, Conflict, and Justice Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, with minors in Diaspora and Transnational Studies and English. Ashwini's unique background, living all over Malaysia, Kazakhstan, Yemen, New York, and Canada, have allowed her to observe matters such as poverty, gender inequality, unequal access to education, and climate change. These lived experience solidified her passion to mobilize youth into tangible action and become a lifelong advocate for these issues. An avid storyteller and writer, Ashwini continues to partake in initiatives that allow youth not only domestically, but also globally to share their voices and contribute directly to meaningful action. Hannah Ahamadi, she, her, is a fourth-year student at the University of Toronto. She is currently completing an Honours BA in Peace, Conflict, and Justice Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She also has minors in Diaspora, Transnational Studies, and History. Hannah is an active member of Amnesty International Canada and serves on their National Youth Action and Advisory Committee. As the previous founder of a youth advocacy group called Disarm the Hill, she also enjoys spreading awareness surrounding Canadian arms exports and industry's impact on human rights abroad. Rooj Ali is a 12th grade high school student who is the youth co-chair of the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit and a youth coordinator for Reverse the Trend Canada. She has been actively engaged in nuclear disarmament initiatives since 2019 when she attended the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit hosted at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Since then, she's taken part in various events and projects, including the launch of Reverse the Trend, Save Our Planet, Save Our People, where she is a coordinator. Rooj is a member of the Canadian Council of Young Feminists and currently has an internship with Senator Marion McPhedran, where both projects overlap. She co-led her city's successful campaign for the Icann Cities Appeal in 2021 and completed the International for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada. She will Trend Canada and hopes her participation can spark positive change. Maya Garfinkel, she, they, is a fourth-year student in Political Science, Honors, and Geography, Urban Systems. Outside of academics, Maya organizes primarily with Divest Mcgill, Students for Peace and Disarmament at Mcgill, and the Divest for Human Rights Coalition at Mcgill. They also love to read, cook in excessively large portions for their roommates, and hammock in the park. She is thrilled to join the IPPNW Canada panel and is looking forward to connecting with other organizers to learn, share, and grow. I'm sure I can speak for everyone that we too are looking forward to hearing from each of you in order to learn and grow. And I think now each of you are going to speak in turn and Marguerite will coordinate that.
Thank you so much, Maureen. And thank you all for joining us and being speakers today. So I'm going to pass over the torch to Ashwini and let her say a few words.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marguerite, and thank you so much, Maureen, for the introduction. I'm so pleased to be here with you today, and I see a lot of familiar faces, so that brings me a lot of happiness. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everyone just give me a thumbs up if you're able to see. Awesome. Okay, wonderful. So hi, everyone. Good evening to most of you. My name is Ashwini Selvakumeran, and my pronouns are she and her. And as aforementioned, I'm currently a fourth-year student wrapping up my last year of undergraduate studies at the University of Toronto. So my major is in Peace, Conflict, and Justice Studies with a double minor in Diaspora and Transnational Studies in English. So today I'm coming to you from the city of Toronto, which encompasses the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about some of the peace activism I've been working on. So before we begin, I thought it might be nice to provide a little bit more of an overview of what I'll be talking about today. Last summer, I served as a peace campaigner for disarmament with the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, or WOW, and I'm sure that is an organization that many of you are familiar with. That is actually how I met Magritte and Leah, so I'll always hold that close to my heart. I specifically worked on why Canada needs an agenda for disarmament and that campaign that we put out last summer. And currently, I also sit as the founder and co-president of a peace nonprofit organization called the Brown Citizen Circle. So in today's presentation, I'm just going to share a little bit of the activism that I have and am doing with both of these organizations. So let's start by talking a little bit about disarmament, and I'm sure many of you are already aware of what that is. But just as a recap, disarmament relies on the sophisticated and nonviolent practice of conflict prevention, diplomacy, and mediation. So it courageously, creates the space for reimagining the concept born of security and re-envisioning the role of the state. It can also liberate international relations from the threat and use of armed forces. Unfortunately, throughout my work last summer with the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, I learned that the Government of Canada and the Parliament of Canada have still not performed a comprehensive public study on disarmament. In fact, the last time the Senate and the House of Commons performed a study was over 30 years ago. So in particular, last summer throughout June to August of 2021, I was in charge of leading the WOW disarmament campaign, which tackled why exactly Canada needs disarmament for climate justice, youth development, and sustainable development. So what I did was I was able to conduct a numerous amount of interviews with many different youth advocates for nuclear disarmament and peace among a few high-level stakeholders throughout my research. And this really allowed me to learn that disarmament is essential to maintain international peace and security, protect civilians, and really promote sustainable development. It also is capable of supporting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG number 3, which is good health and well-being, SDG number 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and SDG number 16, which is peace, just, and strong institutions. And WOW really believes that the current funding that we have going towards disarmament can be instead invested into First Nations communities to provide vital support and aid, fix the ongoing water crisis, alongside committing to tackling other domestic crises in Canada. At the conclusion of my research and work term last summer, I published a 2-page handout entitled Why Canada Needs an Agenda for Disarmament, which entails some of our key asks coming from WOW. These include developing a national action plan and conducting a public analysis of military spending that considers the opportunity costs, among a few of our other requests. And you can actually find this full handout by going to the bottom of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace webpage on disarmament and clicking download. But for anyone who might be interested, I can also include a link in the chat after my presentation. Now, I want to transition to talk a little bit about the not-for-profit organization I founded for peace, which is called the Brown Citizen Circle. And a little bit about why I founded this not-for-profit organization is because throughout the past summer, I found that I really enjoyed engaging with youth. I loved hearing your voices on some of Canada's most current and pressing political and social issues, not limited to disarmament, but climate justice, socio-political life, and academic institutions. However, I recognize that oftentimes racialized youth or youth of color were not being included in these issues or their discussions, oftentimes because they do not know much about these issues. Sometimes I would find my face as the only woman of color or WOC in the room, which was a bit alarming as I wanted more racialized youth to be able to understand and learn about these issues. With this in mind, I really came with the aim or the goal to start some sort of peace building or community organization that was capable of amplifying the voices of youth. I placed a particular focus on the communities of South Asian, Black, and Indigenous underrepresented voices, as that made up the main population in my community of Milton, Ontario at the time. And as a result, the Brown Citizen Circle, or the BCC, was born. So a little bit about the Brown Citizen Circle, or the BCC as I will refer to it. The BCC was founded last April 2021, alongside that same time I was starting to work with WOW in the summer. And initially it was founded as a community organization to amplify, validate, and equip the voices of Black, Indigenous, and South Asian youth, and make sure that racialized youth voices have their impact heard in decision-making spaces through cultivating shared dialogue and allyship. Our main goal is to achieve Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG number 16, which is peace, just, and strong institutions, as I mentioned before. Our board recognized two problems in terms of the solutions we are aiming to bridge. Number one is that young racialized voices are unable to participate equally in spheres of influence and decision-making because they have been limited in the past and do not face the same opportunities as more privileged youth or communities do. Number two is that most current day initiatives cannot appropriately capture the lived experiences of marginalized populations because they are not being included equitably into the conversation. So as BIPOC identifying youth ourselves, and I'm speaking on behalf of our board, we understood that a lot of the traditional socio-political and academic institutions alongside dialogue were not really designed with the idea of racialized youth success or socioeconomic longevity and growth in mind. So we really wanted to transform these modern day institutions to listen rather than speak over the capability of our voices. So we have implemented many solutions, but today I'm just going to talk about our first one, which is community. And what I will say is that community means that throughout the past 10 months, we have engaged in consultative and stakeholder research across Ontario. So this meant we really wanted to sit down with youth at the forefront of these issues and partner with like-minded community organizations to actually understand the direct needs of BIPOC youth. We really wanted to validate and amplify their experiences and mobilize their requests into meaningful events. And some of the events we've done in the past, you can see here, is a climate activism panel where we actually talked about climate justice and disarmament for racialized youth and how they can get involved, alongside hosting a reconciliation circle by partnering with Indigenous communities, specifically the Huron-Wendat communities and the CRE, which is the Canadian Roots Exchange. So these are some of the long-term events we have done that have made an impact, and we really hope to include youth voices equally in the conversation. But this brings me to our current initiative, which is called BCC Bridging the Gap. And this is our annual youth-led social policy case competition. So this is a snapshot from the case competition we put out last year, where GAP stands for good health and well-being, climate action, and economic prosperity. So throughout the course of last summer, the BCC was invested in hosting an action campaign that holds space to acknowledge voices that have been marginalized in our greater communities throughout the GTA. So we came up with an idea to host a youth social policy case competition at the end of last August that was targeted towards mobilizing underrepresented youth voices with the resources that are needed to deliver their ideas in combating stigmatization during this time. So we've all been stuck in the COVID-19 pandemic for quite a while, and the ongoing impacts have especially affected racialized youth and exacerbated the ability for all youth to participate equally in spheres of decision-making and influence. So the topic of our case competition last year was to analyze the COVID-19 response management and impacts of climate action, economic prosperity, and good health. We also aim to provide youth with the opportunity to learn more about the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, to bridge solutions towards peace, while engaging in solutions making that can also address the many inequities that have been augmented by the pandemic. And we grounded our case competition in 3 subtopics, as aforementioned. So these are as follows. Subtopic number 1, which is environmental justice relating to SDG 13, climate action. Subtopic number 2, racialization in healthcare, which is related to SDG number 3, good health and well-being. And our last subtopic, equitable organizations, which is related to SDG number 10. And I realize they are a little mixed up on the slide. They're not in order, so apologies for that. But we chose these SDGs because we found that they are interconnected, and we wanted to give a platform for youth to come up with peaceful initiatives that might be targeting their communities in need right now. And through our initiative last summer, we were able to engage with over 250 youth across Canada, and we really were able to launch a social media campaign to garner interest and really make sure that the youth impact continues throughout our term. At the end of the case competition, we actually sent all of the successful solutions, or the solutions making models that the competitors built, to the House of Commons to publish youth advocacy solutions for peace. So it was a very influential event, and we had Ms. Severin Suzuki, who is the daughter of David Suzuki, speak as our keynote. So a lot of great things happening at that event. So I'm just going to wrap it up by saying thank you so much for allowing me to talk a little bit about some of the peace activism and alongside youth advocacy I've been doing over the past few months. We are continuing with the Brown Citizen Circle and the work with WOW Never Stops. So I'll be happy to send some links through the chat if anyone is interested. I'm also happy to take any questions later on when we enter the Q&A period. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ashwini. Seriously, it's so wonderful to hear from you and all the amazing work that you're doing. Like Ashwini said, we're going to have our Q&A section just after everyone's spoken, just so everyone can have enough time and we don't get too far into Q&As. Next, I'm going to welcome Hannah to our speaker and give her the opportunity to say a few things about her own work. Hannah, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you virtually. My name is Hannah, and I use she, her pronouns. I had a slideshow, but I've decided I'm not going to show it just because I'd rather see everyone's faces. So please excuse the no visuals, but alas, here we are. Thank you for taking the time to create space for me to come and speak to you. It's definitely a privilege to be in a Zoom room with tons of familiar faces, but also new people that I hope I can meet in the near future. But yeah, I am a graduate student at the University of Toronto Victoria College. And similar to Ashwini, I have just finished my degree in Peace, Conflict, and Justice Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. During my time there, the majority of the focus that I tend to have is on the Middle East and Africa, specifically relating to conflict and anything relating to religious violence and peace building. At the current moment, I am a researcher at the Reach Alliance, and the Reach Alliance was created by Joseph Wong and is hosted at the Munk School. And in this position, I'm conducting research surrounding global innovations that are happening on the ground and the impact that they have on different communities. So specifically, I'm working in South Sudan, looking at information dissemination relating to peace, specifically in Juba. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. But in the past, I was a intern at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and I recently just finished an internship as a program development intern at Jumpstart Refugee Talent. So as you can see, I have my hands in quite a few different pots, but I think it's because I like to do different things that keep me both engaged, but also just very happy. So yeah, I think coming into today, how I originally got involved with peace activism was when I was 16, and I was approached by someone at my high school who was involved in Amnesty International. And as you can see, it's 6 years later and I'm still involved with Amnesty, so you could say our relationship is quite strong. I started out as just a general youth member, and now I serve on their National Youth Action and Advisory Committee. And I also help with stuff relating to accessibility that's happening on the staff level and throughout the governance of the organization. I hope everyone in this room knows about Amnesty International and the amazing work that they do. But if not, Amnesty International was founded in 1961 and is a human rights organization that focuses on creating a platform to talk about different human rights issues. So in the past, a lot of this focused on the death penalty, freedom of consciousness, things along those lines. But as we've seen recently, Amnesty has really diversified the different topics and campaigns that they're engaging in. And I think for me personally, what makes Amnesty different is they really open up a space to allow youth to, take a leadership role, go out, engage with the public, whether that's signing petitions or making movie films at your nearest kind of campus production place. I think there's tons of space for youth to pick what they feel most passionate about and then moving forward from there. And I think that's how kind of I got started and what's kept me with the group for so long. I will say, aside from Amnesty, how I really kind of started to zero in on disarmament was because I saw their campaign relating to Saudi Arabia and Canada's exports surrounding arms. And it's been something that I have I'll be frank, I have fixated about over the past couple of years. And I recently actually presented my final kind of paper slash idea for my PCJ program, focusing on the International Arms Trade Treaty and the impact that that has on Canada's arms exports and whether it has made a big difference or whether it hasn't. So it's something that I try to incorporate in all aspects of my life. And although Amnesty is not focusing on disarmament at the current moment, just because they do have a lot of other campaigns going on, it's still something I've been trying to keep on top of. So recently, I've been working with World Beyond War and Labor Movement Against the Arms Trade, and they have been doing tremendous work surrounding Canada's exports to Saudi Arabia and keeping the government held accountable. So at the end of March with that group, we actually held a rally in downtown Toronto to signify 7 years of the war in Yemen. And we then went to Chrystia Freeland's office and we kind of like shared messages of peace, but also gave a space for different members of the Yemeni diaspora to talk about what is happening in the country and the significant impact that Canada is having on creating not only war, but also just like a lot of destruction in the process. As someone who's part Yemeni, it's a topic that really hits close to home for me. So I can definitely say that part of it is, you know, interest in disarmament, but also just like a personal connection that I think is really important that also should be like kind of put to the upfront. But yeah, I do a lot of kind of engagement in my community and that's something that I really appreciate and I enjoy. But at the same time, recently, or well, not recently, it was a year ago, but I feel like in COVID times, everything is like a month ago and you're like, many eons. And it's like, no, Hannah, this was like 2 years ago. You're getting your time mixed up. But with a group of people that I've met at my university and also just through different social networks, we started a youth advocacy group called Disarm the Hill. We are not big, but all I can say is, you know, it's not much, but it's honest work. And I think that's what matters. So we like to meet up and look at Canadian arms exports news. Specifically, we've been looking at the reports that they've been publishing every year since 2019 when they signed the ATT. And what we enjoy doing as a group is going over that information, looking at discrepancies, seeing how it matches up with how disarmament is being talked about in the Canadian media. And a lot of the work that we've been doing is just mostly us educating each other, but also kind of providing a platform to us to then go and share that information with members in our community. There's definitely a lot of like space to grow, and coming into my 4th year of university, I definitely had to take a step back from the work that I was doing with Disarm the Hill. But nevertheless, I think it's a topic and an issue that will continue to be relevant in our lives and as we continue to go forward until we as a society and as like an entire international system decide that enough is enough, and that we no longer are okay with war happening. Because you could think about it this way: we have self-driving cars and people going to the moon, but we still haven't been able as humans been able to kind of decide, how do we prevent war and how do we stop it? And I think that's something that I often wrestle with, is there's innovation in so many other sectors of society, and yet there's so little being done in something that really does impact our day-to-day lives and that will impact people for how many years to come. And it's definitely not simple. It's not simple to say, oh, we can stop war, we can abolish prisons. Like, these are definitely difficult issues that take a lot of time and energy that needs to be put into it. But at the same time, I think we often forget youth have a very interesting way of looking at issues. You could tell someone, okay, how do we decrease the export of arms? And of course, you're going to have like generic examples that are good. But I think when you give a youth or someone who's 12 or 13 a mic and say, what do you think? They often can come up with creative examples that you wouldn't necessarily think of. And I think personally, if we gave more youth the opportunity to engage in governance and public speaking on the international stage, but also just within Canada, the world would be a much different place. And I think I can say with confidence that it would be a much more beautiful and safer place. And although I don't know if that will happen in my lifetime, I do know that we as a group of people can come together and ensure that one day that can eventually kind of be built on. So that's a lot of kind of my little spiel. I am definitely a talker. I've been told by many, but thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. And I'm almost at 10 minutes. So please, if you have any questions, send them in the chat. I definitely would love to talk to everyone and even hear about your own experiences. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for joining us. And seriously, I think everyone here very much agrees and resonates with your words. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Rooj, who is joining us from Winnipeg now and is a high schooler who's been working in this field for quite some time as well. Thank you, Hannah, for just speaking, and Rooj, take it away.
Thank you so much, Marguerite, for the introduction, and also for Hannah and Ashwini for those wonderful presentations. It's my first time meeting some people here, but I also do recognize some familiar faces. So it's wonderful as ever to be speaking to all of you and just kind of give a little bit of like my background and some of the things that I think that would also resonate with Ashwini and Hannah and also Maya when you go on and speak. So my name is Rooj Ali. I am a senior high school student, and I currently do various areas of work regarding nuclear disarmament with organizations like Reverse the Trend Canada. I have also had communication and worked with other organizations that were mentioned, like Voices of Women for Peace, and have collaborated with many more on various campaigns and projects. I'm calling in from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which before I even get into this presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people. This is important because taking into consideration Indigenous people's perspectives and also presence in this huge discussion on nuclear disarmament, weapons, and peace is an important note to take note of and also include. I will share my screen to just have like a little bit of a presentation to provide some visuals. Give me a second. Is everybody able to see my screen okay? Okay, that's wonderful, thank you. Okay, so to get started and to kind of just give some background into my background into this movement and how I got started, we'll kind of give you some feedback into my introduction to all of this, which was in 2019 when I attended the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit. Myself, much like all of my other peers, had no knowledge or prior awareness of what nuclear weapons were or what exactly they meant and what their catastrophic consequences meant on the global world scale and how they still affect us to this day. The most I had ever heard in school was on the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in our schools, they would read us books about it. And myself, as well as my classmates, would sit in sadness and would be devastated by the story, but there would be no further info on that. And I think at that point in time in grade 9, I got reintroduced to the topic. And what really struck me was the lack of awareness. So I got involved with the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit. And through the summit, I was introduced to some phenomenal people, some people who I met at the summit who are on this call, which one of my colleagues is actually here, Avan Ashpal Singh. I've been working with him for some time, and also Maureen. So those are some people that I got introduced to. And these are some people that I got to know better. And with their guidance and also their support and working with them, I began to understand why nuclear weapons and youth presence in the peace movement is so influential and important, and that we need to take note of it. Following the summit, I continued to do work with people, always being very grateful for the amazing people that I got to hear from. And just last year, whilst going on with these campaigns, I was introduced to the Icann Cities Appeal. Now, I would like to say this was a really great example of taking this work and bringing it to a local scale. the Icann Cities Appeal focuses on getting municipalities to show their support against nuclear weapons and support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now, unfortunately, Canada is not a signatory to the treaty and has often been very adamant on carrying on that discussion. And this is where the Icann Cities Appeal plays a really crucial role in Canada, because I believe now it is over 16 cities in Canada have shown their support and have endorsed the appeal. And just last year, I co-led a campaign in Winnipeg that got Winnipeg to support the Icann Cities Appeal. So this was huge. What really made it stand out was that this campaign had been going on for many years, since 2017. And it had been ongoing in various cities around the world. And it was really starting to gain traction. But in the prairie provinces, there had never been a city to do this or to show support against nuclear weapons. And what really struck me, as well as the people that I worked with, was once again the lack of awareness. There was such little education on the topic, and people really just did not know much about it, even though it was so present. Until this day, nuclear weapons are continuing to be advanced and pushed forward. And till this day, important voices like Indigenous voices, people of color, youth, all these people's voices are not quite taken into consideration as much as they should be, and not taken seriously. It's a topic that isn't taught in schools nearly as much as it should be, which that in and of itself needs to change. And that kind of goes into some of the work that I'm currently doing with my work with Reverse the Trend Canada, is working on an Icann Cities Appeal how-to document. In order to replicate the success we had in Winnipeg, we're wanting to get other youth from other cities in Manitoba and across Canada to also come forward and say, like, they can also do this as well. And it's not just limited to the people in the higher up positions who are considered to be more knowledgeable on the issue. This conversation is welcoming to all and needs the perspective of all people from all backgrounds, and it intersects with all these various groups of youth and young people, and especially those that are already working within the movement. It's important to also note that with this, the reason why the conversation is so fundamental is that nuclear weapons are one of the most significant threats facing us in the 21st century. This isn't a fact that can quite be debated, as it is very present, especially with the current stage of the world and the things that are going on. You really got to take note of how nuclear weapons play into that conversation. And nuclear weapons also play really well into the conversation of climate change, as many of the impacts of nuclear weapon creation and also uranium mining, which is needed in the creation of nuclear weapons, has devastating impacts on the environment. And these are points where you really start to notice, like, wow, this conversation connects to so many other areas of our present day activism. And there's a lot of people who are already very invested in climate change, nuclear weapons, and working against them and working to abolish them is something that more people can actually see that they can have an interest in. So it's looking at that and looking at how youth involvement can start to increase, and also important to work with organizations who are trying to work more with youth. I myself was lucky enough to have an internship with IPPNWC last summer. It taught me a lot, and honestly, I came out of it with more connections, more wonderful people to go back to and speak to, and also a greater understanding of how there is a present system that is being worked on and built that encourages youth engagement, because that is very much lacking. And considering that youth are the ones that are going to have to take on this mantle and work on this issue in the next decades to come, it is important and really needs to be a key cornerstone and key point that we involve youth voices in these conversations. Like myself, whom I was very lucky to have been at the right place at the right time, I'd say, in 2019 with the Youth Nuclear Repeat Summit, and I've taken it from there. But I don't think it needs to stop with just myself or a few of my colleagues. I do feel and believe that it can very well go further. And some of the current projects I'm working on include, as I previously mentioned, the how-to document on the Icann Cities Appeal, which the facts for have been finished. The document is now in stages of having its graphics finalized, which then will be officially published, I guess I will say, through Reverse the Trend Canada. Not just stopping at that point, there's a lot more that can be done. In particular, and I believe, Ashwini, in your presentation, you made a note on how there's a lot of education lacking for people of color. I myself came to Canada as a Syrian refugee, and I work very closely with the newcomer community in Winnipeg. And I have also found that many of them are they're not as educated on the topics of nuclear weapons, let alone politics. So right now, another really important project that's being led is giving them that necessary education and showing them that their voices matter just as much as anyone else who has lived here for a much longer period of time. It's important to have these conversations, and when you have these connections with these communities, when you have even if you don't have a personal tie to it, it is present, and we need to have these open talks with people. So something that I'm currently working on is trying to create a project that focuses on education to newcomers and also just the general community of young people in high schools, because it's really not talked about enough when it really should be. And it is present, and it's going to be affecting us for decades to come. And if there's any indication of that, it is the current state of the world and what's going on overseas. Those notes are important to take into consideration and say, okay, maybe it is time for sure to do something about this and not walk on a tightrope that we've been walking on for over 75 years now, since the horrific events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's making sure that we don't recreate those events, and also saying that youth can have a say in all this, and they should. And a lot of my work is on youth, and also saying that youth should have a say, and they can, and there is no limitation to that. So there are many projects currently underway that I've been very fortunate to work with other people on and hear some of the wonderful ideas people have. Because if there's one thing I've learned is that collectively working together in a group rather than just on your own, especially on a topic as pressing as this one, is going to have much more fruitful results, and is definitely going to have a lasting impact. In my case, I was able to have internships with IPPNWC and currently holding an internship with Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, with whom I'm also working on many of these projects and working on getting youth to the table, getting youth to not the Youth Nuclear Peace Summit, but the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons conference that's happening in June. So these are just some examples of current initiatives taking place that are really calling for youth presence, and also not to ignore the fact that it is not just with youth, but also with the guidance of those that have come before and that have been present in this movement much longer, that all of this can be possible. So there's a lot of things happening, and it's really exciting to see the potential, but it's also important to push it further and not stop once some positive results have been seen. Because with this kind of work and with this kind of topic and initiative, you really need to push further past that point and really make a point of saying that I'm here, I'm present, and I have something to say about it, and my voice as a young person or any person really matters in this conversation. So that kind of wraps up my presentation on my, I guess you could say, upbringings into this movement and what I've been doing, and also working with some wonderful people. Thank you so much for having me speak on this panel.
Thank you so much, Rooj, and very glad that you also were able to spend some time with us over the summer. We valued that so much, and you as well in your work since. I'm now going to welcome our next speaker, Maya. They're currently located in Montreal and are an active activist around here, where I'm also happen to be located. So I'm going to pass off the mic now to Maya. And once again, if any of you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them afterwards. And we'll also have a little bit of Q&A session. So Maya, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you all to the previous 3 panelists. I'm truly just feeling like a sponge right now, just soaking everything up that has been said, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully that'll help follow along, but I now see why Hannah was keen on seeing everyone's faces, because now I can only see 5 of you, but that's all right. Oopsies. I'm just going to go back. So, hi, my name is Maya. As Magritte said, I'm currently in so-called Montreal, and I'm here today on behalf of a few different organizations. I think I am the person here who is maybe the least directly on the surface connected to the peace movement, but I'm hoping by the end of my little presentation today, you'll have a better idea of why I think the work that I've been doing at Mcgill is actually really, really connected to the peace movement and broader demilitarization and disarmament movements beyond IPPNW as well. So, in the last year, these are some things that have been happening at Mcgill. These are some headlines that we've been seeing. There's been stuff around divestment for human rights, and I'll explain what all this stuff is, but I just kind of want you to see a little bit of the breadth and depth that has been going on. There's been a lot of activity, at least the sense that I'm getting is that with the pandemic, people were sort of bursting at the seams to do something. They wanted to take action. And I'm really excited to tell you all about some of the action that we have been taking. So these are some of the organizations that I'm going to briefly touch on today. The 2 that I'm going to focus on the most are Divest Mcgill and the Democratized Mcgill Coalition. The other 2 that I'll just briefly mention are Students for Peace and Disarmament at Mcgill and Divest for Human Rights campaign. These are all sort of interconnected, but just briefly, Divest Mcgill is a campaign that aims to fight for Mcgill to divest from the fossil fuel industry. Currently, Mcgill has many, many millions of dollars invested in the industry, including in TC Energy, which is currently building the CGL pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory. Next, Students for Peace and Disarmament is a campaign at Mcgill that was started by our lovely Magritte and Leah, who many of you may have been, and many of you may already be familiar with. And this is actually how I first got involved in this sort of work. Those 2 lovely ladies just wrangled me right in there, which I'm very, very grateful for. And I sort of got my start at this sort of student organizing level through Students for Peace and Disarmament, which, just as it sounds, is involved at sort of at a few different levels, fighting for disarmament, both like within Mcgill University and harmful military research at Mcgill University, but also beyond, sort of serving as a hub for peace activism at Mcgill and Canada and in the global setting. These last 2 things, number 3 and 4 here, are 2 different sort of coalition type campaigns going on at Mcgill. The Divest for Human Rights Coalition includes Divest Mcgill, Students for Peace and Disarmament, and many other sort of campaigns going on at Mcgill, including Students in Solidarity with Palestinian Human Rights, the Indigenous Students Alliance, and many, many more. And that campaign is pretty new. It's just over a year old, which we're really, really excited about. And I know that probably from afar, it seems like I'm kind of touching on a lot of things that are separate, but like I said, I'm going to try to tie them all together. And then lastly here is the Democratized Mcgill Coalition, which is a very, very new coalition. It is only about 6 months old, but it is one that I feel really passionate about and one that I actually think connects very strongly to the peace movement where it is right now. And more specifically, that campaign, I should specify what it is besides just naming it, is that it is fighting for Mcgill to be a more democratic institution, which I'll explain sort of why we're focusing on that a little bit farther. And this picture that you see right here is from an occupation of a Mcgill building that actually just occurred this last semester that I'll dive right into later, but that's sort of just a little taste. So moving on here, I wanted to talk a bit about democratization at Mcgill and what this means. So currently at Mcgill, the Democratization Coalition was founded because divestment and the fight for divestment has been going on at Mcgill for almost 10 years now. And through those 10 years, we've been fighting for divestment both within within the structures that exist and outside the structures, fighting with outside. And throughout this time, there's been people that have resigned from the board. There's been 1,000,001 different types of actions. And a through line that we started noticing in the last few years was that every time we would hold an election or file a petition or have a presentation all towards this board of governors that decides where our money is going, it was ignored every single time. And this turns into something that is not a coincidence. It's because a lot of the people on the board, most of the people on the board, are not actually invested or involved in the Mcgill community. And this is something that I really want to highlight, and that is like a really big part of my belief in like student organizing and organizing in general, is fighting for there to be more people who are actually from the community involved in decision making, which is something that I kind of see other organizations here that are being discussed talking about. We want more people who are actually impacted by issues being the ones speaking on those issues. We don't want people who are fossil fuel CEOs deciding where their money's gonna go, which is actually a real thing that happens on the Mcgill Board of Governors. There's people who are fossil fuel CEOs, and it's not really a surprise that they're shutting down fossil fuel divestment, because as we know, those folks are not exactly keen on taking money out of their own pocketbooks. I'm just going to skip right through here. This slide order should have been farther at the beginning, but these are just some of the examples of how Divest Mcgill has been working within the system versus working outside the system. And like I said before, there's a lot of parallels with this and the peace movement. I think the climate justice movement and the peace movement are not just intrinsically tied together because they feed into each other, literally, like the way in which militarism feeds into the climate crisis. But beyond that, I think the social movements behind these issues are also having strong parallels. And I'll get into that a little bit more here. So this is something that you might be really familiar with. Petitions and filing things within the system is something that I did as well with Students for Peace and Disarmament at Mcgill. And I sort of had an inside scoop into seeing exactly how the peace movement, through my work with Students for Peace and Disarmament and my work with Divest Mcgill, sort of happened parallel. And one of the key parallels that I've seen, just to say it really explicitly, is that there has been time and time again where motions and efforts within the system have been ignored, which isn't new for social movements. But I think that we're sort of at a tipping point, at least for Divest Mcgill. And I think in some peace movements as well, where we're realizing that this work within the system cannot happen by itself. There needs to be also movement from outside the system pushing in a more aggressive way. And I know that not everybody is down for that kind of approach, and that's totally okay. And I'm happy to talk about that. But that's sort of what we've been learning in the Divest Mcgill movement right now. I'm just going to move here. This is some of the examples of how we started working against the system. And I guess when I say against the system, a better way to put it would be like from the outside. There's a lot of diversity of opinion, like within Divest Mcgill, of how against the system we should be approaching things. But these are these sort of actions that we are taking. And I'm just going to skip right through here, please. So I wanted to focus specifically on a way in which working against the system is important for, not against the system, from outside the system is important for demilitarization and the peace movement. So as I mentioned before, the Divest for Human Rights Coalition at Mcgill is included with Students for Peace and Disarmament and Divest Mcgill. So here you can see one of the ways in which the Board of Governors, which is our highest body, is rejecting anti-military and like peace movement work that's been happening at Mcgill. As you can see here, there is a lot of money. There is over $200,000 of Mcgill's endowment fund that's generated by Lockheed Martin, which is a really, really harmful weapons manufacturer based in the United States that also has research labs at Mcgill. And for years, for 10 years, over 10 years, there's been movements at Mcgill to cut the ties between Mcgill and Lockheed Martin. Just like how there's been movements to cut the ties between Mcgill and TC Energy, building the Wet'suwet'en pipeline. And for years, there's been movements with students protesting, professors resigning, petitions, elections, all the sort of democratic processes that are supposed to theoretically get us what we want at the end of the day. And what we're seeing here is a real disconnect between what the majority wants and what the leaders in charge are actually doing. And to me, that's a key takeaway. That's kind of my thesis, if you will, of this presentation, of why these two things are connected, and why I think democratization is really where the divestment movement is going to be headed in the next few years, and where I think maybe a strand of the peace movement might be headed in the next few years, where we see, like I said before, a real disconnect between the people in power and the people who are saying what they want. And here we can see another connection to the fighter jets. So it's all connected, folks. All right. This is just a quote from Greg Mickelson, who's a formerly tenured Mcgill professor who resigned over Mcgill's third refusal to divest in 2019. And this is sort of hitting the crux of what we're getting at here, which is, in order to divest Mcgill, we have to democratize Mcgill. And I would actually substitute this with, in order to demilitarize Mcgill, we have to democratize Mcgill, and substitute that with whatever word you feel is representative of what people are wanting and not getting. So now I'm going to move on to like a little bit of a case study of what has happened in the last few weeks. On March 7th, Divest Mcgill entered the Arts Building, which you may be familiar with. It's sort of the quintessential building that when you think of Mcgill. We entered that building and we set up camp. And what happened there is actually the beginnings of what ended up being the longest occupation that ever happened at Mcgill just this March, which we are really, really proud of to say. And this is just going to be the start of continuing to campaign and escalate pressure, not only to divest, but to divest for human rights, to decolonize, to demilitarize, all the things that people have been asking for and not getting. It's kind of reaching a stage where we're done asking politely and we're starting to prefigure our own power structures. And you can sort of see my interest from the political science angle coming in through here, really thinking about power structures and social movements and how we can begin to build power in a way that capitalizes on people's knowledge about these issues. Once they have the knowledge, what do we do with that knowledge? And this is the kind of thing that we want to keep doing with that knowledge. So here you can see a little picture from one of our democratization assemblies. And I'm just going to slide through here. This is a photo from a presentation when lovely Leah, who is a part of IPPNW, was presenting on disarmament. Here you can see she's showing a map of a nuclear, like what a nuclear attack would look like, which I'm saying in a perky voice, but is not a perky thing to say. And this was a really amazing opportunity, not only for us to escalate pressure against the administration, but also for us to community build and educate and spread the word about these issues in a way that like was really accessible to people, because we were right there in their building. So they were able to stop by and learn in a way that was really meaningful. And I'm just showing some more pictures. This is sort of more about what escalation looked like. The occupation lasted about 2.5 weeks cumulatively, which was a really, really amazing accomplishment that I'm not just trying to pat myself on the back for, but that was also something that sort of reverberated throughout the city. Concordia University, which is the other Anglophone university, also started occupying after 1 week. And UDM, which is one of the Francophone universities, also started occupying about 1.5 weeks into our occupation, and actually won divestment after about a week of occupation there. So even though it wasn't Mcgill, we still feel like this is a part of a movement that we are going to continue, and definitely a win that we want to celebrate. And I think that's my last slide. And I really appreciate everyone's patience with my sort of all over the placeness. As it was mentioned, this is the beginning of the final season, and the occupation very recently ended. So it's still kind of in my brain trying to put it on paper. But I really do feel like the element of democratization that was so integral to the movement and prefiguring our own power structures is something that I want to keep seeing, and something that I really believe youth are passionate about. Like was said before, when you ask youth sort of what they want out of a system or how they believe change can happen, you get creative ideas, such as, why don't we just democratize the university instead of trying to keep convincing people that are clearly not going to be convinced? And those are sort of the kinds of things that resonate a lot with me when I think of the sort of stakes, the high stakes that are here in both the climate crisis and the peace movement. So thank you again for listening to my chaotic presentation, and I really appreciate you all being here.
Thank you so much, Maya. And it's great to see that kind of action happening in such a concrete way that, especially I think sometimes in the peace movement, a lot of us are spread out physically. So it's great to see that many people physically together doing that kind of work. And thank you to all of our speakers for joining us. And we were so excited and happy to have you. And we're going to be moving into our